We are still working on understanding transformations of nutrients from one of these pools to the others. And we left off in the last session by looking at mineralization phenomena, so biological control of nutrient release from soil organic matter to the mineral phase so that the nutrients can be taken up by the plants. And the last thing we learned was, what I have here, is that this nitrogen release in this case is controlled not only by the activity of the microorganisms, but also by the quality of the organic material. And there's a range, as we have seen before, a range of different quality parameters that can depend on just the nitrogen content. CN ratio is a very popular parameter for predicting nitrogen release. Then polyphenol contents, the lignin contents, and all kinds of ratios between those. And you can see that sometimes when spanning a large, wide spectrum of qualities of litter, that can be even curvilinear relationships with thresholds in it. Nitrification, we have heard that, or many of you have heard that already before, that in many soils, nitrification is actually much faster than ammonification. So the step from organic nitrogen to ammonium is usually slower than the step from ammonium via nitrite to nitrate. And that is especially so in warmer climates. And that translates also to a greater uptake of nitrate, as seen in this example. Here's a recovery of nitrogen as ammonium or nitrate in the soil or crop after one cropping season with potato in Turkey. And you can see here the application was 400 kilograms of nitrogen, which is actually quite a lot for this area and this crop. And then we have a recovery in soil of 57% of the added nitrogen was recovered in soil as nitrate. Another only 1% was recovered as ammonium, although the nitrogen form added was an ammonium sulfate. So we added ammonium. However, after one cropping season, we almost find no ammonium of that added ammonium in the soil. 57%, however, of the added ammonium was already present as nitrate. And the crop took 25% of the added ammonia up as nitrate, not as ammonium. The uptake of ammonium, of the applied ammonium, was almost negligible. So that means, and we have talked about that earlier, in what form nutrients are taken up usually by plants. And we have learned that energetically, actually, it would be much better if the plants take up ammonium because they have to reduce it anyhow to amino acids. But actually what they do is very often they just get nitrate because the nitrification is so rapid. So what they do, they have developed mechanisms where they actually can quite efficiently take up nitrate because they have actually no choice. The reverse of mineralization and mobilization of nitrogen, so the flux from organic nitrogen to inorganic nitrogen, is called immobilization. Here the same graph, again it's valid for, or an important process for nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur, those three nutrients that have an important organic phase. Same graph as before, but I didn't blank out certain areas. Here, the added material and their CN ratio as a function of time. And you see that we started with a relatively high CN ratio of 60. Just a guess, what kind of material could that be? Would that be alfalfa with a CN ratio of 60? No. What could that be? Corn stalks, that's good suggestion. Yeah, some crop residues from cereals is a good suggestion. They might have something like 60. Do you remember from our incubation experiment and greenhouse experiment that you guys are doing, what are the CN ratios of different materials that you added?
Sawdust.
Sawdust. How much was the sawdust? 400 or so. So that's That's not sawdust, so that's not wood. It's not legumes. What would legumes have, maybe? Legume material. Sorry?
Like
10 to 1 is already very narrow, yeah, but it could have 10 to 1, 10, 15 in that area. Around 15, 20, if it gets higher, we probably see immobilization. If we have 15, lower 10, we probably see a net mineralization right away. What is a benchmark for microbial biomass, for instance, carbon to nitrogen ratios for microbial biomass? What do microbes have, CN ratio? 8 is a good value, yes, somewhere around 6, 8 in that area. So theoretically, as long as a material has really very much above a CN ratio that the microbes have preferentially to take somewhere nitrogen because they don't get it from the material. With this 60 here, and let's pretend it's some cereal residue, maize is a good suggestion, that we have probably at the beginning a net immobilization. The CN ratio goes down with progressing decomposition. Carbon is respired. You see here the CO2 level goes up. But at the same time, the nitrate level goes down because as they metabolize the crop residue, they need to take nitrate from somewhere or nitrogen from somewhere. It can't come from here because it's not enough in there. A CN ratio of 60, it's just not enough. So they have to take it from somewhere. And they take it from the soil, and that's why the nitrate levels go down as the CO2 evolution goes up. And that's what we call immobilization. And that happens for phosphorus, that happens for sulfur, that happens for nitrogen. Once the enough CO2, carbon, is respired, that the CN ratio goes down, actually a net mineralization takes place. And you see here they put here a number of, let's guess it's somewhere about 15 or so, probably, where the net mineralization sets in, and all of a sudden then the nitrate appears up again and nitrogen is released in the soil. So that's then the mineralization part that we looked at before. It's very interesting that what we observed for the mineralization and the nitrification appears to happen also for the reverse process of immobilization. So there's a difference between nitrate and ammonium. It seems that more nitrogen is immobilized in organic matter with ammonium than nitrate nutrition because, as we said earlier, it's energetically more favorable to reduce the ammonium to amino acids than start with a nitrate and have go via ammonium and then to organic matter or amino acids. So you see here with the incubation in days and the amount of immobilized nitrogen as a function of, this is potassium nitrate and ammonium sulfate, you see that the ammonium sulfate is much more rapidly immobilized in soil organic matter than the nitrate is. So also there are important differences between ammonium and nitrate, and it's very, very understandable where that comes from if you look at the energetic balance. Here we see an example how in real world, with real data, the mobilization, immobilization of different nutrients work in relation to carbon. And this is an example from the southern Amazon and different tree species, a palm and a fruit tree species. And here we see initial mass remaining over a time period of 1 year for carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus for above peach palm, so one species and another species down there. And you see here for the peach palm, in percent of the initial, we see a relatively steady and rapid decline of carbon, that's these dots down here, and concurrent release of nitrogen and phosphorus. Pretty much as the carbon is mineralized, we also get a release of nitrogen and phosphorus. with this species here, completely different. This species, yes, there is a decline in carbon, so we get mineralization of the Cupuaçu leaves, but it's not as rapid as for the other species. And actually, the nitrogen release is not happening at all for the period of observation. So we have still about 100% of our initial nitrogen in the litter layer after 1 year. With phosphorus, it's even worse. We're getting more phosphorus here in the litter layer. So it seems that the microorganisms draw phosphate from the soil into the litter because the litter apparently is so poor in phosphorus that in order for the microorganisms to feed on the litter, they need to draw phosphate from the soil solution into the litter. And so again, similar to the nitrogen release, also the phosphorus release and the phosphorus immobilization largely depend on the quality of the organic material. And the peach palm has a high phosphorus content, high nitrogen content in their leaves, decomposes very rapidly, whereas this Cupuaçu has very, very rigid leaves, very waxy, like a ficus that you might have at home. It's very waxy leaves, and it takes a long time to break that down. If you look under Cupuaçu trees, by the way, a very, very tasty fruit, so you can make ice cream and juice out of it. It's a fantastic fruit. There is always a very thick litter layer underneath, although this is a humid tropical environment, but the leaves don't break down very easily. And actually what's also interesting with this species and the litter layer is that the roots are very superficial. They come actually into the litter layer. So if you take these leaves away from the litter layer, you see that all the Cupuaçu roots are stuck to the leaves. And you can easily understand why, because the nutrients are not coming out of that leaf. So if the nutrients don't come out of the litter layer, then the roots go to the litter layer and literally stick to the leaves and try to suck out the nutrients before they even get into the soil. It's a very interesting phenomenon. And that leaves us going to the next big process that controls nutrient availability in soil. And that is weathering. Weathering is, of course, a soil-forming process. If there was no weathering, we wouldn't have any soils, probably. We would have rock. So the first step in soil formation is weathering. And only then organisms can use those weathering products and make soil out of that. But what is interesting for us now at the moment is the release of nutrients that is associated with weathering. There are different types of weathering and processes through weathering. Very briefly only, they're divided into physical, chemical, and biochemical processes. And there are a range of different ways how rock can be weathered by temperature, cryoplastic, salt weathering, etc., etc. I don't want to go through this. This is more subject of an introductory soil science course. But you see here already that there are these different pathways. There are completely physical, chemical, and biological pathways. And there's a range of different possibilities how weathering can actually happen. Also something that you're probably always bothered in introductory soils courses and in chemistry courses is the different primary minerals. So these are not these clay minerals or oxides, the secondary minerals that we've been talking about when we discussed adsorption. But these are the primary minerals in igneous rock or sedimentary rock or in granites, in all kinds of rocks that you might encounter. So what I just want to indicate here, these are the chemical formula, and you see in all of them there are some nutrients somewhere. So here's magnesium, there's a calcium in augite, here's an iron, magnesium, manganese, iron, there's another iron, potassium in the muscovite, potassium in the microcanths, orthoclase in the feldspars. So that's where the nutrients come from. A big exception is which nutrient is missing from here? nitrogen. There's not really a nitrogen primary mineral. So nitrogen is missing here. And we had that before. There's not really a weathering product, nitrogen product from weathering. Phosphate is not very common, but there's one important one, and I'm not even sure if it's on here. Which one is the phosphate? Apatite, yeah. So that's the phosphate mineral, and it is in many soils, not very, very abundant. That's why we're having this problem in very many soils with phosphorus deficiency. But there are also large deposits of apatite. This is also something that you will have in more detail in soil chemistry classes, but just in brief, just to give you an idea of the stability of different secondary minerals. So we have these primary minerals that you saw on the previous slide, and they're weathered. And the weathering products then form new minerals, and these are the so-called secondary minerals. Primary minerals, secondary minerals. And these secondary minerals are then the minerals that we've been talking about when we talked about adsorption. Kaolinite, gibbsite, allophane, and so on and so forth. And the formation of those different minerals depends on the weathering products, but also then how fast these weathering products disappear in a direction. How can weathering products disappear from the soil? Erosion and something else. Erosion is very often, yeah, erosion is important, but it wouldn't necessarily change the relationship. It would just erode everything, not change the relationship between those. What would change the relationship? The other big export, apart from gaseous losses, which is not leaching. So it could be that we have weathering products from primary minerals, and then selectively one of the weathering products is escaping us by leaching. Potassium is, for instance, in highly weathered soils. That's actually what's happened. We have weathering and then a preferential export of, for instance, potassium, and that will change our possibilities. What new secondary minerals can actually form. And if all the bases and potassium are leaching, we have very acid soils that we will get to a different secondary mineral. Very popular loss is also silica. We have already learned that the basic building blocks for secondary minerals are silicium tetraeders and aluminum octaeders. So silicium and aluminum, and the relationship between those two is key for the formation of secondary minerals. So if silicium through leaching is preferentially leached out of the soil, then we will have different possibilities only to build secondary minerals. And you see here, that's why this diagram of how much of this silicium is in here, and this usually done by logarithmic scale, because otherwise it would be too large, of the silica acid, and the logarithm of potassium activity and pH. And that gives us the stability diagram for different secondary minerals. So if we have a lot of silicium and relatively low amounts of potassium and low pH, we get mainly kaolinite, and that's in the humid tropics down here. The gibbsite happens if we additionally lose a lot of silicium, then we get gibbsite, because gibbsite is an aluminum oxide. And if we still retain a lot of potassium and the pH is high, the muscovites microclines are still stable. So this is just an idea. It's nothing in this class that you need to really know by heart, but just to give you an idea that there are primary minerals, they are weathered, formation of secondary minerals, and which secondary minerals are actually built depends on what happens in between. And major processes, for instance, leaching, that some of these weathering products go out. And here just a cartoon to illustrate that for something of allophane to take off, you have to have then certain conditions on the way. You have to have high silicium still retained, rhyolitic parent material, then comes low silicium but still aluminum rich, and I think it needs to be humid. There we go, there's a rain cloud, and then allophane takes off. So it's just a cartoon to illustrate that there are really narrow pathways often for these secondary minerals, and only under certain climatic conditions and edaphic conditions you get the formation of one particular clay mineral, and there are many, many around. But these different clay minerals are very, very important for, again, as we have seen, for instance, adsorption. Whether we have an allophane, a gibbsite, or a vermiculite makes all the difference in the world for our soil. All the difference. So that's very important. Another interesting observation is, for instance, for phosphate, we said nitrogen has no importance or low importance. Phosphorus, we already said the apatite is the primary mineral here, and how that evolves over time into weathering products. And a good study area that researchers have worked now for a couple of decades or even longer is the Hawaii Islands. There might be a multitude of motivations to work in Hawaii, but one is certainly this one. There might be other lesser important ones. But it's really interesting. Here we have a chronosequence, what is called a chronosequence, or also false time series, that on the different distributed on the different islands we have areas that are differently old. Here on Thurston we have a lava stream that is just 300 years old. So there soil development had only 300 years, and vegetation development 300 years time. And then if you go on the other side of that mountain, you have a lava stream with 2,100 years, and so on. And you can work yourself backwards 4 million years and string that together. If you sample them on the same day, you can have this false time series. Ideally, you want to have the same spot sampled over 4 million years, but nobody can really wait that long. So the only way of doing that is false time series. It always had some problems because you need to postulate that the climate is the same all over, and that also you have really the same parent material at the beginning, which is also sometimes shaky. But for very careful sampling and with good assessment of the environment, you can actually do that. If then we look at the different phosphorus forms, and here over this very, very long time scale, so from very young lava streams to very old lava streams, from 300 years to 4 million years. Here expressed in phosphorus concentration per unit area, so that's the concentration of phosphorus, and here is a percentage of total phosphorus. And you see at the beginning we have dominant calcium phosphates, because there's still the apatite there, it's the primary minerals, and very little of everything else. But you can see over the first 10,000 years or so, we have a almost complete disappearance of the calcium phosphates. So it takes a while, it takes 10,000 years, but then it seems all this apatite was actually weathered. It was completely gone. But we get an increase in organic phosphorus, so apparently the plants take up the inorganic phosphorus and the leaves fall down, and that creates then organic phosphorus. So we get a buildup of organic phosphorus, but slowly also we get a buildup of inorganic adsorbed phosphorus and even occluded phosphorus. And if that is expressed as percent of total, you see here we seem to have 80% after 400 years, 80% still as calcium phosphate, 0 then around the 10,000 years, and then over the next few million years we have an increase in the occluded phosphorus. So moving from a primary mineral into solution, up in the tree, down with the organic matter, cycling in the soil, but inevitably with the rebuilding of the clay mineral structure, we get more and more occluded phosphorus. And that's what we're left with then with a highly weathered tropical soil, is then a lot in the occluded phosphorus. So that's actually a very neat opportunity to study that, and it shows you how weathering and soil formation changes these different forms. And the ballgame is completely different here for agriculture or forestry than over here. Completely different. And that's something we need to be aware of. Weathering is important also for other elements. Here, for instance, sulfur as an example. There's, of course, some abiotic oxidation possible, but mostly this is a biologically mediated phenomenon by famous diabacilli. And very often sulfuric acid is formed in the process, and then you get this pollution of waterways, for instance, the surface waters in sulfur mining sites, and that can create quite a big hazard, environmental hazard. You see all this orange around here. That's from the sulfur that is then reprecipitating. In arid areas, we have gypsum formation, and that we will look at later a bit. Potassium weathering, we have seen that a lot of primary minerals have potassium actually in them. The most important are the feldspars, but also micas have a lot of potassium. And here, for potassium, the weathering product actually ongoing today, even in older soils, can be significant. And here's a figure to illustrate that. Here we have depicted the soil potassium concentration, this time in centimoles charged. Sometimes people use millimoles, sometimes centimoles, so we all have to take care that we look at the units that people use. As a function of soil depth, up to 6 meters, so these guys have dug really deep. This is a site in South Carolina at a very old growth experiment. I think it was a afforestation experiment that was started in the 30s or so on old cotton plantations in the South, and luckily was maintained over the decades. So we still have samples and these original experiments. But what you can see here, under this plantation, under this tree plantation, we have a almost uniform concentration of exchangeable potassium with depth. So that means, yeah, we have a little bit more maybe at the top cell, but not quite that much. But if you look at the non-exchangeable potassium, so the potassium that is more occluded in minerals, in weatherable minerals, we see a very steep increase with depth here. Why do you think that would be? What's a good explanation for that, Joseph? That could be this kind of behavior. If you have an increase at depth, it could be a leaching and demobilization or so further deeper down, but not really in the non-exchangeable form. What is another explanation?
What about increasing clay concentrations?
So that they are
fixed more at depth? I don't know.
Possible that you have maybe a different clay formation. Either there's a geological discontinuity, or you have some clay leaching and a different formation of clay, and then you get fixed potassium down there. It's also a possibility. But let's say there's the same clay mineralogy from top to bottom, no geological discontinuity. So what else could that be? There are always several possibilities, but and you only have that graph to feed from, so I have to get some background. Let's say this non-exchangeable potassium is really in primary minerals.
So there's less weathering going on down at depth. So,
and why is that? Why is less weathering going down at greater depth? How is weathering mediated?
There'd be less fluctuations in temperature.
Yeah.
Different environmental effects
Yeah.
that cause weathering.
What is an important one, for instance? We said the different course categories.
There's like freezing and thawing.
Yeah.
Temperature.
Yeah. These are all physical ones. What other broad categories of weathering do we have? Physical ones.
Weathering.
Chemical weathering, another one. Biological weathering. So we have those three ways that weathering can happen, and it's very easily understandable once you have all the information that obviously you don't have, but that most likely there's a lot more weathering happening up here through all the root action, through acids that are produced in the rhizosphere, through temperature, moisture, freezing, thawing, whatever. I don't know how often it freezes and thaws in South Carolina, but it can actually. There was a big storm, I think, a few years ago where everything was frozen over. But so there are a multitude of different processes, and they probably act more up here than down here. And the trees then actually take that up. So that means that the action of root action and weathering actions in this forest has depleted, at least definitely in the first 50 centimeters or so, but also significantly up to 2 meter depth, the potassium reserve and the non-exchangeable form was released. And only here, probably down at 3, 4, 5, 6 meters, we get the more or less original clay mineralogy. So that is pretty interesting case study. Calcium, multitude, as we have seen before, different minerals that have calcium in it, in calcareous soil and arid soils. Magnesium, pretty much the same, a bit shift. And both of them, magnesium and calcium, as you can gather, similar to potassium, have significant flux from weathering. Zinc, there are some zinc minerals, there are some copper minerals also for that. We don't need to look at that in detail. Same for boron and molybdenum. Also, there are certain primary minerals that can release, although they're in minute amounts, but we know also they're also needed only in minute amounts. This is something we want to quickly look at still. Does it really matter? We have already seen that weathering draws down the potassium concentrations quite a bit, even in weatherable minerals from forest. Is it really an important flux, this weathering, for an ecosystem? Here for different elements, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, the values are given in kilogram per hectare per 30 years. Weathering from igneous rock over 30 years, for phosphorus, somewhere in the range of 5 to 25 kilograms per hectare. For potassium, a lot more. For calcium, a lot more, a very large range, depending on if you have calcareous soil or not. Magnesium, a little less, but also quite a range. Now, what happens if we have a forest here and we have a forestry intervention and we export nutrients over a 30-year cycle? Probably after 30 years you do that the first time. You see that for phosphorus, for potassium, even more pronouncedly for calcium, and also for magnesium, actually the weathering, amounts of weathering match what you export. So it seems you don't need to fertilize. In many forests, and maybe in most forests, where weathering really matches the export over that cycle. So yes, you're feeding on your natural resource capital, on your soil, but you can do that probably for quite a while. That's also the reason why normally you don't fertilize a forest. You just feed on weathering. So weathering for this type of agricultural system, if forestry is considered an agricultural system, a land use system, weathering is really an important process. However, for an export, for instance, by a corn, wheat, soybean rotation, we are way below with our weathering. I mean, these 5 to 25 are nothing compared to 1,200. So obviously, for a corn, wheat, soybean rotation, we need to fertilize phosphorus. There's no way that weathering can help us here to a significant extent. Differently, sometimes with potassium, that's also the reason why in very many cases potassium is not fertilized. In many systems, if farmers can afford it, it is. But in many systems, it's not the primary limiting element. Calcium depends really on the parent material. If you have lime soil, no problem. You can crop forever. Weathering will do your job. You don't need to fertilize. Same, very often for magnesium, it can be a problem, but also there, in many cases, you don't need to fertilize. But phosphorus, you can easily see there's no way around it for agriculture. But for forestry, weathering is really a significant portion and can match and compensate for all your exports that you have. Thank you very much, and that's for this morning. We'll see each other then in the afternoon for the laboratory. So please look at the section for the next, excuse me, next group that you're interacting with. Yeah, we see each other at 1:30.